Legend Total War here, and today we're going to be doing another tier list using Tier Maker, this time covering Rome Total War's faction tier list for both the original Rome Total War game and the Barbarian Invasion. This tier list will also cover Rome Remastered, because there's, in my opinion, no real difference between the quality of the factions compared to the original and the remaster. But before we get into the tier list itself, I need to let you guys know, of course, that this video here is sponsored by Manscaped. So you guys know I've been with Manscaped for ages now. Love the product, love working with them. I'm going to talk to you today about the lawnmowers, the 3.0 Plus, the 4.0 Pro, and the 5.0 Ultra. I've been with Manscaped for so long now that I've had a chance to use all three of these throughout the time that I've been using their products. The lawnmower is primarily a groin and body hair trimmer, but I use it for pretty much anything. For shaving my face, for shaving my head, and whenever I do any kind of body hair removal, I do it kind of quickly and kind of roughly. So the fact that I've never once injured myself using these products is a testament to how safe they are. Because, like I said, I'm really rough with them. Because I like to get things done quickly because I've got other things to get done. And that's why I recommend Manscaped products. So if you want to get 20% off plus free international shipping, check out the link in the description and in the pinned comment. Big thanks to Manscaped for sponsoring this video. Okay, with that being said, let's get into the tier list itself. So I think there's a lot of things that we need to cover first in terms of criteria before we place anyone anywhere. Get a feel for what's going to make a S tier faction and what's going to make a D tier faction. Obviously, everyone's going to have their own personal favorites, so I'm going to try to be as objective as possible as to what makes a powerful faction, not just necessarily fun. Because really, all of these factions can be fun if you personally enjoy the way that they play. So it's not just about the army roster, although factions that don't have access to elite units are definitely going to be heavily penalized. They're going to be disabled from getting to S tier. And factions that are unable to progress beyond tier 3 or tier 4, that is also going to impact on them. Because as you build a massive empire throughout your campaign, you're eventually going to encounter the distance from capital penalty. There's no way to avoid that if you're going to play that long into the campaign. And having buildings that are able to maintain public order, but more importantly, to replace the cultural buildings that somebody else has built, so get rid of the culture penalty, is equally important. So for example, if some faction has built a tier 4 building of walls, and your faction is unable to build tier 5, and since it's not possible to demolish any section of walls, you're permanently stuck with that tier 4 walls, causing public order problems, whereas some factions are able to build a tier 5 wall and get rid of that culture penalty. So those ones will be higher ranked. And speaking of factions that can do that, let's start with the 3 Roman factions, the Julii, the Brutii, and the Scipii. So all 3 of these are instantly going to enter D tier because they're clearly the worst factions. And I'm just kidding. S tier, obviously, if anyone was going to enter S tier, it has to be them. These are the most overpowered factions in Rome Total War. These are the easiest to use because they rely very heavily on heavy infantry, which is very easy to use. You don't have to worry about like pikemen positioning. Pikemen are very good units, which they don't have access to. But you know, who can deny that urban cohort don't just slap? And they're not even really that expensive. The legionaries and even the late Marian, pre-Marian reform units are super good. They've got access to light cavalry and heavy cavalry, a good array of artillery and specialist units like dogs and pigs. And I wouldn't really go for those units, but they're at least available there to you. These factions have access to the Senate, which can sometimes provide benefits, also sometimes provide problems. They start off in a 3-way, actually more like a 4-way alliance at the start of the campaign, allowing you to really just focus in one direction. You don't have to worry about getting completely surrounded at the beginning of the campaign. So super easy campaigns. You obviously have the civil war later on in the campaign, but playing as any of the other factions, well, you got to fight Romans anyway at some point. So everybody at some point has to fight some Romans. Now, in terms of the differences between these 3, they're pretty minor, but some people will really argue some of these points, like, no, definitely Brutii, that's the strongest one, because that's the one I've heard the most people say is strongest, right? It comes down to what you value, and it really comes down to the max level Pantheon building that they can build. So when it comes to the Julii, they focus primarily on population growth and public order, which is something that I personally value. So I always consider them to be the best, but that's what I personally value. Then Brutii, they focus on trade income. So a lot of people will be like, oh, make more money as the Brutii. But personally, I feel like make enough money anyway, so that little bit extra is unnecessary. But whatever. to each their own. And then when it comes to the Scipii, they have the best military upgrades through their religious buildings. But really, all three of them are S tier in their own right and about equal. Now, a lot of people, I think, will argue that the Brutii are the best because they also get to invade Greece at the beginning of the campaign, and Greece is some of the best territory in the world because of all the landmarks there, the wonders of the world, which is true. They do get to invade Greece very early on, but the Greeks are also a tougher opponent than, for example, the Gauls. And that being said, playing as a Julii, there is really nothing stopping you from just wheeling about after conquering northern Italy and going straight into Greece ahead of the Brutii and get there before them. Same thing with the Scipii. There's nothing stopping you from just grabbing Sicily in its entirety and then whizzing over to Greece to get there before the Brutii. So whichever way you want to play it, you can do that. Now, moving on to Carthage. So I'm going to put Carthage at A tier because I think that the Romans are really just a cut above of them in this case, in just terms of max potential. Like, the Carthaginians have got some good things going for them. But the thing to keep in mind is that they have to fight the Romans fairly early on. And if you go to war with one Roman, you kind of go to war with all the Romans. Invading Italy early on can be very difficult, whereas invading Carthage early on, it's pretty easy. They've got a decent roster. I don't think it's quite as good as the Romans. It comes down to they've got really good elephants, which the Romans don't have any of. But that being said as well, elephants are not the most difficult unit to get rid of, and they're super expensive and they take a long time to recruit. So it depends on how you look at it. They don't have better infantry than the Romans. You know, their best tier of infantry is sort of the middle of the rung for the Romans. Their cavalry is fairly decent, but the Romans can match them on that. In terms of their economy, they start off in a really rich city, for sure, but in terms of their actual buildings, they're maybe slightly behind the Romans in terms of what their maximum potential are. If the Romans get a hold of Carthage, they can kind of build it up better than what the Carthaginians can, just because, you know, they're OP by design. But still, very strong faction, like in the upper tiers of A tier there. Then we've got Numidia. Now, Numidia is kind of like a carbon copy of Carthage if you cut out all their best units. So Numidia is going into C tier. Now, I know immediately some people will be like, what are you talking about? This is definitely a D tier. This should be a double D tier. This faction sucks. I've heard it all before. I've played Numidia. Hear me out. Numidia does have a crap roster. Their roster is absolutely awful. It basically revolves around just skirmish units and just trash tier all around. Really difficult army to utilize. However, that is not the only thing that matters. There are factions out here that I've reserved for the D tier because they have trash tier units and they're also economically screwed. Whereas at least the Numidians have pretty much the same buildings as the Carthaginians. So at least you'll be able to afford loads of trash tier units and your public order won't completely collapse on you compared to some of these other factions when you get into the late stage of the campaign. And I think that is quite important. Also, trash tier units are cheap, so you just get more of them. Okay, Parthia. Now, Parthia is a difficult faction to use, but if you know what you're doing, they're definitely an A tier faction. They're good economically. They start off at the very eastern edge of the map, which can be good for a defensive position, so you're not surrounded on all sides, which is something that the Romans also sort of get that sort of luxury. They have some of the worst infantry in the game. Now, in a game where you're supposed to use a lot of infantry, that might seem like a downside. However, cavalry is pretty damn good in Rome Total War, and Parthia arguably has some of the best cavalry in the game. You've got fast light cavalry, you've got really good horse archers, you've got long-range horse archers, you've also got heavy elephants, you've got access to, camel cataphracts, so you've got anti-cavalry, heavily armored units. When it comes down to field battles, the Parthians really are some of the best fighters in the game. You could even argue better than the Romans. However, assaulting walled settlements, they're awful at it. Their infantry are trash tier beyond belief. They're like tier 1 infantry for the Romans. Absolute garbage. Basically, the only way that Parthia is going to capture settlements is if those settlements just aren't defended. You basically need to get a decisive blow on the enemy on the field before you even think about trying to besiege a settlement, because their units are so trashy. Okay, now, as for Armenia, Armenia is pretty similar to Parthia, but I think that their roster just doesn't have quite as many use, like missing the elephants. They're a little bit more surrounded. So I'm going to put Armenia at B tier, but these guys here, trash tier infantry, really good cavalry, but their position just isn't quite as good, I think, as Parthia. I think by design, like Parthia was one of the emergent powers of the time, whereas Armenia was not so much. Was a bit, but not quite as much. Then we've got Pontus. And I know what you're thinking. I don't want to play Pontus, right? Pontus is like a hybrid Greek and Eastern faction. They've kind of got mid-tier of everything. They've got okay pikemen. They've got some trashy infantry. They've got some decent cavalry, good skirmish cavalry. Their general's bodyguard's pretty decent. They start off in a relatively rich area. But the thing is, being okay at everything is not as good as being fantastic at one thing. So I'm going to put them at B tier, because you can do a lot with them. I mean, culturally and economically, all of these guys here, they're all quite good. But I think their roster and start position sort of lets them down a little bit. They're definitely better than Numidia by a long shot, though. Then we've got the Greek city-states. So I'm going to put them at A tier because I think they're really good. I think they're also a little bit overrated as well. Some people will be like, how can you put them at A tier? They're clearly S tier because they have Spartan pikemen. Yeah. Okay, so best pikemen in the game, for sure. Them and Macedon. Go to the Greek city-states. Now, the thing is with pikemen is that they are good defensive units. So if you've got a few units of pikes, you can defend against massive armies, for sure. But they're not great at assaulting settlements. They're very finicky to use. You need a lot of experience to know how to use the pikemen to stop them from twirling around. I mean, if you've watched my Europa Barbarorum campaign, you know how much trouble I have with pikemen assaulting settlements. And I don't think I'm the only one with that. Because pathfinding in Rome Total War is just really wonky. Especially when you're trying to navigate through tight corridors. So playing on small unit scale can also be fairly useful for them because it's a lot easier to move them around with that one. But pikes are super strong. They've got kind of mediocre cavalry, and they got basically no heavy infantry whatsoever. So very one-side faction, the pike faction here. In terms of economy, same as these guys here, able to build tier 5, good cultural buildings. They start off with landmarks with the Statue of Zeus. That's a particularly good one because of the public order faction wide that it provides. So A tier, I believe, belongs for them. Now, when it comes down to Macedon, I think they're pretty similar to the Greek city-states. Maybe even just slightly better because they may not have quite as good pikemen as the Greek city-states, but these guys here have better cavalry, which I value cavalry quite a lot. Now, that's not going to make them better at assaulting settlements, but it can make them better at field battles, so you don't just rely on holding the line. You can actually flank as well, because the cavalry for the Greek city-states is basically light cav and skirmish cav only, not something that you can rely on very much. But yeah, the Macedonians, I think they're a bit more versatile. I think they have a little bit more of a tricky start position, being more north. They'll have more barbarians to deal with, which invading barbarian territory, it's not that valuable. I'm looking at you there, Julii. But they're just a faction that you're going to have to deal with. Whereas these guys, they don't really border any barbarians, at least to begin with. But yeah, I think they're on the same tier there. Then we've got Bronze Age Egypt, which is a bit of a weird one here. They really should be Ptolemaic Egypt and be a bit more Hellenized. But for some reason, they made them Bronze Age Egypt. They brought them back from the past, essentially. This faction is a bit of a weird one because I'm going to put it at S tier. But you got to hear me out on this because their roster is not the best, okay? So their pikemen is mediocre. Their cavalry is mediocre. They've got some really good chariots, but what really sets them in S tier in terms of their roster is their archers. They've got the best archers in the game. So their archers are able to, if they're experienced enough, even pierce the armor of Roman units. So once you get to that tier there, every other unit is just supporting their archers. So they're really good on the battlefield, and archers are great at defending settlements and assaulting settlements. So you've got all of that covered. Culturally, these guys are actually kind of the best in the campaign because their highest tier religious buildings are kind of, in many ways, better than the Roman ones, or at the very least equal to them. They're able to grow super quickly and project their power quickly because they start off in arguably some of the richest territory in the world. And they're just able to project their power just as quickly as the Romans. You don't start off anywhere near the Romans, and so by the time you do encounter the Romans, you're a real fighting force, and even if they combine all their forces together, you can usually put up a good fight. So this is a very strong faction here. Okay, then the Seleucid Empire. So I'm going to put this one at A tier. hear me out with this. I know some people will be like, oh no, B tier. Seleucid have a really good roster. They got heavy elephants, they got good cavalry, they've got good infantry, mediocre heavy infantry, I mean, but they've got really good pikemen as well. So they've got a lot of versatility. They also start off with a lot of territory, which also means they start off with a lot of enemies. So difficult start position, but if you're good at the game, you can really overcome the immense odds that they can sometimes be dealt with. But that also means that with all of these resources available to them, they can capture more territory and make more money from loot that way. So a little bit tricky with the Seleucids, but I think that their roster compensates them. With adequate management, they can project their power just as much as these other ones here in A tier. I think they're a bit behind the S tier ones. Culturally, they're quite good. Anything that can build to tier 5 and build their religious buildings up that far is pretty damn good in the late stages of the campaign. And also, their elephants are amazing. Definitely on the same par as Carthage. Okay, then we've got Thrace. So Thrace is kind of like a barbarian with a bit of a hint of Greek faction taste to it. These guys, I've played this one before. They're shit. I'm not going to put them at D tier. I'm going to put them at C tier, at the same tier as Numidia. Here's the thing about Thrace. They have got really light, heavy-hitting infantry, and that's kind of it. Their cavalry is rubbish. Their culture is okay, maybe a little bit below the actual Greek ones, but they can at least build up their settlements, more so than the barbarians, which we'll get to soon. But this is a tricky faction to use because they are very weak on the battlefield, especially if you're playing on very hard battle difficulty. Very much glass cannons, so I'm going to put that one there at C tier. Okay, now we're moving on to the Barbarian faction. Now, for the Barbarian factions, might get a bit of heat for this, but they are mostly carbon copies of each other, for the most part, with a little bit of difference in between, just a little bit. So starting with Dacia. Dacia is going into D tier, because as a Barbarian faction, it just can't build up its settlements that high. Its roster is okay, they can get some decent units, but nowhere near as good as pretty much everyone else here. I think their roster is better than Numidia and Thrace for that matter, but not being able to build up their settlements beyond tier 3 is a huge problem for them in the late stage of the campaign. You're going to notice a trend coming in here with these barbarians. I'm going to be saying the same thing a few times. All right, then there's Gaul. So Gaul is going into C tier. It almost entered D tier, and it's probably at the bottom of C tier. And the reason why it's going into C tier is because I think that of the barbarian factions, this one's roster is pretty good, and it gets it fairly quickly. Getting the chosen swordmen and archers going, their cavalry is pretty decent. They also start off with a lot of territory, but that also means you got to deal with the Romans very early on. However, a competent player can either run away, hope the Romans go somewhere else, or you can manage to fend off the Julii. They've got more advantages, I think, than some of the other barbarian factions. But generally speaking, them unable to push beyond tier 4 is a massive problem for them, meaning in the late campaign, they really can't sustain big settlements at all and have to constantly go back and exterminate them. So that's why it's ending up... It's like the borderline... They almost made it into D tier there, but I think their start position just gets them a little bit more of an edge over Dacia, just because they start off with more territory. They start off with territory in northern Italy, in most of Gaul, and in Spain. So they start off with an already established empire, and that's a big deal, I think. Then we've got Britannia. Okay, so Britannia. This is a weird one, because they've got access to chariots, and chariots can be very powerful, so they're good on the battlefield. However, they're a barbarian faction, so they can't go beyond tier 3. So I'm going to put them at the very bottom of C tier here. They only just scraped through, maybe just a little bit less than the Gauls, I think. But it's their chariots that gave them the little bit of an edge. They don't start off with much territory, so that's not their advantage. But they also don't start really off with any enemies whatsoever. So you can chill with the Britannia campaign. In fact, if you play your cards right, you can stay in Britannia, just build up a bit of a fleet, and make sure that nobody ever invades you. So that can be good for them. So this is a campaign that you can essentially not lose. So it's maybe a good starting faction if you want to play as a barbarian faction. Then we've got Spain. Spain is D tier, probably at the bottom of D tier, because there's nothing good about playing as Spain, really. They're barbarian units. They've got the identical units to sort of Carthage's early units. They have to fight Carthage early on and have to fight Gaul early on, really. So they have like less territory in Spain than the Gauls do, or maybe just a little bit more. They don't start off with much territory. The people that they have to fight are very strong, especially Carthage. And yeah, their roster just isn't good, and they're culturally weak. They can't build up their settlements very much. So this is really like the bottom of the rung for Rome Total War. Spain is not in a good position. Then we've got Germania. Germania I'm going to put at D tier as well. However, I'm going to put it at the front of D tier because it doesn't really have any natural enemies to begin with. Its roster is for a barbarian faction. It's got some interesting units for sure, but still not able to project beyond tier 3 is a problem for them. But you've got a lot of rebel settlements around you that you can just gobble up first before worrying about having to fight the Romans or the Gauls or whatever. So there's a bit of wiggle room for them, whereas the other factions kind of have to fight proper factions very early on. Then we've got Scythia. Now, Scythia is a weird one because they are culturally screwed, just like the other barbarians. However, their roster is significantly better because they've got some horse archers. So these guys are really good on the battlefield. So I'm going to put them at C tier, slightly above the Gauls, because I think that their cavalry superiority is really good. However, their cultural stuff, their ability to maintain settlements is absolutely abysmal. So that there is the ranking for Rome Total War. Notice I didn't put anyone under weird. That's largely for Barbarian Invasion, and we'll get to the weird ones. Okay, so moving on to Barbarian Invasion. The Western and Eastern Roman Empire. Now, these two are not going to get the same ranking. The Western Roman Empire is going to enter A tier. Now, I need to talk about this one for a bit. This is potentially a very strong faction, for sure, but it is not the powerhouse it used to be, and it starts its campaign in a really difficult position, basically on the verge of collapse. Whereas the Eastern Roman Empire, far less so. It's got huge religious division, especially in Rome Remastered. It's not so bad in the original Barbarian Invasion, I felt. Their starting units are absolute rubbish, but their endgame units are really bloody strong. That being said, the Eastern Roman Empire starts off with richer territory, has better units, especially with their archers. So the Western Roman Emperor archers, they just have normal range, whereas these ones are better armored and have longer range, basically making them superior, especially considering the enemies that you will be going up against, and that's really important. The Western Roman Empire just isn't particularly good at ranged warfare, and that is going to be effective against the mass amounts of horse archers that will probably invade you. And so being able to outrange those horse archers gives the Eastern Roman Empire the edge on them, which is why I'm going to put them at S tier. Now, the Huns are in a bit of an interesting position because they start off with the strongest military, but they have no economy. They don't have any territories because they're a horde. Now, you can settle as the Huns in Barbarian Invasion, and the best place to go do that is usually Constantinople. So, once you have settled, because it's difficult to conquer the whole world as a horde. I've actually done it before, and it was on a Let's Play, and let me tell you, that was really friggin' difficult, because I started running out of forces halfway through it, and I just wasn't able to replace it. I just had to bloody settle. I really felt like I had to settle at some point. So there is definitely an encouragement to settle, unlike in Total War Attila, where of course you can replenish your forces. I'm going to put these guys here at B tier. Even though the Huns are supposed to be like the big bad threat, playing as the Huns and conquering the whole map is a bit tricky. Now, the barbarians in Barbarian Invasion, they can't reach tier 5, but at least they can reach tier 4. They've got arguably better troops than the Eastern and Western Roman Empire, and you're definitely able to destroy those empires. But are you able to maintain your own? It's a little bit tricky because they just don't have as good cultural buildings, so maintaining public order and overcoming Christianity and Zoroastrianism is a little bit more difficult for them, and that needs to be taken into consideration. Their roster is amazing, but that can't just be the only thing. Maintaining an empire is difficult for them. Then we've got the Sassanids. Sassanids, S tier, definitely. This is the big bad of Barbarian Invasion, and even going ahead of the Eastern Roman Empire. You start off in a pretty comfy area where you don't have to deal with that many barbarians, because the barbarians bring in the big old hordes. These guys have the best friggin' cavalry in the game. So bloody good. And their bodyguards, the Clibanarii, so friggin' strong. They are so hard to kill when you're going up against them. They've got really good culture. They're able to build very good buildings. Zoroastrianism is a good religion. It's able to spread quite easily. So they don't have division in their own lands. Like there's not a whole bunch of paganism and a whole bunch of Christianity. They just get rid of all that straight away. Like with the Eastern and Western Roman Empire, half of their bloody characters are Christian, half of them are pagan. It causes constant problems. Whereas you're just like 100% Zoroastrianism. So you start off united. That allows you to project your power without having to worry about internal issues very early on. So this one here is, in my opinion, the strongest faction in Barbarian Invasion. Super good cavalry roster. That being said, their infantry, shit, absolute crap. But when you've got cavalry this good, you don't really need your infantry, especially considering that cavalry is really king in Barbarian Invasion, and you'll be going up against a lot of cavalry at some point. Someone's going to deal with the Huns, and these guys here, their armor just deflects all their shots for the most part. Okay, then we've got the Goths. So this is a barbarian faction that's a horde, or can be a horde. If you want to complete the campaign, you should settle. It's difficult to conquer the whole map or destroy the whole map as a horde, even with the Huns, which start off with the biggest horde. These guys here, the barbarians get a little bit generic. They kind of all have this very similar roster. They've got some horse archers, a lot of trashy infantry. I'm going to put them at C tier because they can certainly be a threat to the Western and Eastern Roman Empire, but I just don't think they belong on the same tier as the Huns. The Huns are just stronger than them. Okay, then we've got the Lombardi. Pretty much the same sort of situation as the Goths. I'll just be talking about the exact same issues, Unable to build beyond tier 4. Got some horse archers. Similar, very, very similar faction, so C tier with that one. Burgundy faction. Okay, so now we're talking a bit more about Central European barbarians that are able to be hordes. These ones are all right. The Burgundy and the Franks, I feel like, are pretty similar. Maybe I should put the Saxons close by there as well. All three of these factions here are pretty similar to each other, and I kind of believe that all three of them belong in C tier as well. They're less focused on cavalry, much better infantry. They're able to reach to tier 4. Their culture is not as good as the Romans. And what I mean by culture, obviously, I'm repeating myself a bit, is the ability to maintain an empire. So I'm going to put all three of them there. As for how interesting their campaigns are, it's not too difficult because invading the Western Roman Empire is pretty easy. Saxons go to Britain, these guys go into Gaul, and these guys, they start off in Germania, so you go whichever way you want. It's fine with all those. Okay, so Roxolani, these guys are more of a steppe horde, similar to the Sarmatians. I'm going to put them also at C tier. I feel like the barbarians in Barbarian Invasion are a lot better than the barbarians in the original. Definitely because they can reach tier 4. Maybe I should be putting some of these guys here in B tier. I just don't think that they belong in the same tier as the Huns. I know what I'll do. I'm going to put the Huns at A tier, and I'm going to put the rest of these guys at B tier. Yeah. Because all of these factions here, no. I'm going to put these ones back into C tier. The ones that don't have heavy horse archers, because I think that's important. The ones that are just heavy infantry based, I'm going to put there. Okay. So, yeah, we'll put the Roxolani and the Goths at B tier and leave these ones at C tier. Because there's a lot of barbarian factions in Barbarian Invasion, and there's slight differences between them. So I'd say the difference between A, B, and C tier in this one is pretty minimal. Don't worry, I've got a faction reserved for D tier, and we've still got some for weird tier. Okay, don't worry, there's some in Barbarian Invasion for that. Okay, the Sarmatians, I think this is the best out of the sort of steppe horde factions, because these ones, I think they've got the best cavalry. Personally, cavalry is king in Barbarian Invasion. But again, another horde faction that can only reach to tier 4. Then we've got the Vandals. Vandals, again, another sort of steppe horde faction, only can reach to tier 4. In terms of their roster, it's so minuscule, the difference between them. It's just not worth really talking about. Just different named units that basically do the same thing. The Huns, they're a little bit different because their units are actually a bigger unit size as well. So they actually have bigger armies than the rest of them. Then we've got the Berbers. Berbers are shit. D tier for them. So this is a faction that's basically Numidia in the in this campaign. It can reach tier 5 in terms of their cultural buildings, but their roster is rubbish. They just have no good units. Everything is like light units, and that's all they've got going for them. Just light tier troops, just crack. If they go up against the barbarian factions, they just get smashed. The only thing that's going for these guys is the fact that the Western Roman Empire simply can't afford to put up a fight at Carthage. That's it. They have the weakest enemy to fight in the game, and even then they kind of struggle. Just the worst roster for a faction. They've fallen a long way since they were... Because they're basically tagged as the same as Carthage, but yeah, it's super weak. They're basically the Numidia of Barbarian Invasion, and these other factions just absolutely dump all over them. Okay, now we've got the Celts. So, the Celts I'm going to put at D tier as well. The reason for this is that even though they're able to reach tier 4, this is one of the only barbarian factions that cannot turn into a horde. And sometimes it can be really useful to turn into a horde, cause some mayhem, and then settle again. And these guys being unable to do that makes them a bit boring. They also start off in some of the poorest territory in the world, right up north, into the north of Britannia and Ireland. They just are a bit on the weak side. So I'm going to put them there. I don't think their roster is particularly special, especially when compared to the other barbarian factions. They just haven't really advanced from when they were basically Gaul or Britannia. The Alemanni, basically the same sort of problem. This is a more Central European barbarian faction that also can't turn into a horde. I'm going to put that also at D tier. Just because if the barbarian factions can't turn into a horde, I think that just gives all the other factions above them just a massive edge over them. Now, the remaining 3 factions, you might be sitting there going, when's he going to put something under weird tier? Now, this is primarily for Rome Remastered. Doing this is not really something that you can do in the original Rome Total War, which is why I put this under Weirds section. These 3 factions are emergent factions that you can play, meaning that their campaigns, when you put them in here, when you play as them, it assumes a certain amount of time has passed before you even begin your campaign, which means there's this randomization to your campaign. So it is extremely weird what can happen with these ones. There's even a little bit of a disclaimer when you select them. I think it's cool that they actually made factions that allow the AI to progress a little bit before the fucking player shows up and kills everyone. So basically, you're the endgame crisis. But yeah, interesting. So the Goths are pretty similar to the... So these are the Ostrogoths, pretty similar to the regular Goths, but these are an emergent faction. They're not available there at turn 1. These are the Slavs. They start up way up in the north. They emerge at some point, cause mayhem. And these are the Romano-British. So this is a hybrid barbarian and Roman faction, or Western Roman, I should point out, that has access to Sarmatian units. Similar to how the Western Roman Empire does. Really strong faction once you get things going, but emerging, things can be a bit weird when you show up. So that's what I'm going to do there for the tier list. I think there's a pretty good array of tiers there. The only tiers that have a bit above average, well, above the medium, I guess, A tier has got 1 extra and C tier has got 3 extra. These ones here, I didn't even really need to mention them. I just wanted to briefly mention that this is just for remastered, which is why I put it under weird tier. Anyway, I'm sure there's going to be a lot of disagreement in the chat because people get pretty high-strung about their favorite factions in Rome Total War. Just thing to keep in mind is that there is no right and wrong. This is I try to be as objective as possible, but it is still a subjective tier list. Let me know in the comments below whether you agree or disagree as to any of my reasoning about this. And, you might change my mind if I was ever to redo this. But yeah, appreciate you guys. Don't forget to subscribe. Check out Manscaped. Link in the description and pinned comment. Thanks to them again for supporting the channel and allowing me to do these videos. It wouldn't really be possible for me to do them without it. And we'll see you next time. Later, guys.